Welcome to Sundays with Stories. I'm with Dr. Stanton Peele. My name is Zach Rhodes. Stanton, thank you for being with me.
It's great to be here. We're going to begin today by talking about a new version, a new track in the Life Process Program, which we call Empowerment, MAT. As everybody knows, MAT, medication-assisted treatment, has just risen to the forefront of the addiction marketplace. It's backed by everybody, from Drug Policy Alliance to the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And we've commented on that. There's a positive to MAT. In controlled population studies, it preserves lives. In general, when people are taking controlled opioids, they don't die. We have done previous sessions where we've identified the downsides. And why is it that drug deaths are still increasing despite the ascendancy of MAT? And one reason is because there's always a compliance issue. And when people have been sold on MAT and they get off it, they're more likely to go astray or strongly askew, and the death rate then increases. At a psychological therapeutic level, the problem that we identify with MAT for opioid addiction treatment is that it's life and identity defining in a way that can be lifelong. That is, the person is convinced that they can't function without this medical assistance. It's often generally combined with the brain disease theory. So we have come up with an answer. I mean, many people don't get counseling or don't like the counseling that they get as a part of their MAT program. And we are offering an offshoot of LPP that we call Empowerment MAT. And maybe you can jump in and just give a little bit of the outline of what that looks like.
Yeah, well, like you said, we're filling in the gaps and some of the things that people claim that they would make their experience in MAT better, but often don't get. So on one hand, people can be prescribed, especially Suboxone, buprenorphine, with little to no counseling at all. So they can take a trip to a doctor's office and get it and have no counseling. So if they have bought into a story at some point, or that it's the drug that's going to save them, and they see little or no change in their lives, then people often come to the conclusion that, all right, in addition to this replacement drug, I'd like to have some counseling. I'd like to have some sort of a blueprint for how I'm going to make my life better. So we want to offer people our service, which is basically that anyway. But in addition, we want to add some questions about what their experience on MAT is like. And we really should focus on the fact that it's it's a program that we're putting out there for people to choose their own path. So we can have our opinions about what's better or worse philosophically and culturally. But at the end of the day, when it comes to client by client, it doesn't really matter. We want to listen to what their experiences are and what their goals are. And we're pretty well set up to help people achieve those goals in a cognitive behavioral sort of way, getting them to interrogate some of their worst and their best thinking, to ask themselves the kind of basic stoic questions like, what's something that I did today that I didn't like? What's something today that I liked? And what can I do differently next time? And so all of that into one, instead of just a basic CBT track or, answering questions about oneself or thinking about what they want out of life. It's that, but with the specificity and a knowledge base of what MAT is like and how they might want to remain on MAT in a safe and a positive way, or whether they want to taper off of it in some sort of a way.
Now, we're an empowerment program. And for example, I was just talking to a mutual friend of ours, and he's talking about a client who comes to him and says, I don't have any strengths. I don't think I can get through life without addiction. And I talked about a part of LPP that we use We get people, we ask the question, tell us about your greatest success or a problem that you've dealt with in the past.
Yeah.
So instead of arguing with the person that, oh, you're not powerless, or what are you saying? We simply get them to recreate an area of life or a decision situation where they did act in an empowered way, where they were successful, where they're proud of themselves. And that's one example of a kind of experiential CBT approach we use, but with the ultimate goal always of convincing the person that they're more powerful, not less powerful, or as powerless as they've already been convinced that they are supposed to be. And, you know, our third partner in this enterprise, of course, is Aaron Ferguson, who had the experience of going through treatment programs like that, court enforced as an alternative to prison. I noticed that one of the articles in Filter this week was about a person's experience in the drug court system. We've got a whole different liberating way of looking at it. And given that people may be forced onto MAT, they may feel it's beneficial in some ways for them, we're adding on the essential link that they are in control of their destiny, that they're not going to need to depend on this for the rest of their lives, that their life is their life.
By virtue of being, so I guess I should pull back and just in case anybody needs a 101 sort of a crash course on what the hell we're talking about. MAT is medication assisted therapy or medication assisted treatment or therapy. Yeah, I think I said the two. And it means usually what people are talking about when they say MAT are substitute drugs or replacement drugs for opioids like Suboxone or methadone, which gives an inexact but a pretty similar effect to people who use opioids. And the idea being, well, at one level, these are the drugs that are legal and able to be prescribed for this reason. And so people can take them, people can sort of figure out their own dose that they want to take, and it's reliable and it's steady.
They don't usually figure out their own dose. They're assigned that. And it's often made uninjectable by how it's methadone is and Suboxone is presented, like in Vivitrol, so that they can't break it down and inject it. Vivitrol is a different story. It's the same. It's part of MAT, but it's a different story. For the most part, if even the providers who have people on MAT who are the worst at being sort of client-centered, they do sort of have conversations with them about how they're feeling physically and a conversation about what their dose should be. Of course, ultimately, the client has less power to make that choice, so it's whatever a physician or somebody is willing to prescribe. But the goal, if I'm going to give their best side of the argument, would be that people are getting a drug and it's a dose that makes sense to them, and it's stable and it's safe, and people aren't going to die when they're on it. And as you said, then you get into drugs that are meant to dissuade folks from using opioids or other drugs. Naltrexone, which is in a form called Vivitrol, like you said, which can be given as a shot that lasts for a long time. You know, it's long lasting, like for a month. And it blocks opioid receptors so that when people do opioids, they get no real pleasure from it. And those are medications, and there are different ways of distributing them or thinking about why these things work or why they don't. But there's something of a difference between a person saying, I'm taking replacement drugs or I'm on MAT, and saying, I use drugs. There's an element of agency that's stripped from them a little bit just by being in the system, being able to legally take the replacement drugs. And our partner, Aaron Ferguson, who is an outreach manager for a national provider, points out that quite often on their own, half the times or more, after some period of time, a year or two, they'll fade out of using the drug intentionally. They themselves will develop a feeling of agency and feel that they can proceed on their own. And whereas that's often discouraged, it's certainly discouraged by 12-step and the brain disease theory, but often by providers. And we're not telling anybody to get on or off it, but we're giving them the tools by which they feel they can use the period under which they're on MAT as a reorganization, a personal recertification period, so that they can proceed on their own.
In other words, right now people have a couple choices, and one is you go to a kind of a programming that says you ought to remain abstinent forever. And if you don't, if you use drugs of any kind, then you've failed that program, or failed that sort of a treatment regimen. And then now there's an alternative that says, well, you can use this kind of drug. These kind of drugs are okay to use, and but you've got to stick with it. And if you don't come back and use them, or if you go use other kinds of drugs, then you're kind of failing the program too. There are obviously, those are not the only two preferences that a human being could have in their relationship with things that they consume. So we're trying to add some agency to provide that third or more sensible element.
An essential element. We think the LPP finds it, and I think the data support it, the basic element in real recovery, the personal agency. So now I know that people watching this will imagine that we've clearly solved all the problems in the world, and we've got such winning personalities that nobody could possibly disagree with what we've just presented. And where else can you hear what we're talking about? Talking about MAT in a real world setting with the real world consequences and alternatives. But occasionally we do get objections to our point of view. Maybe you can describe some that you've heard, Zach.
A few have come in, and you get, I think you and I are used to getting pushback, you more than I, but for anything.
Well, I'm older than you.
That we say. Yeah, maybe it just is accumulated years. I don't know. But then also there are people who are more or less sensible, but who only have the templates available in order that they use in order to make sense of addiction and what it means. So I think what we're doing here is trying to get ahead of what seems to be standard knowledge or stories about what addiction is and how to achieve,
and ways of thinking
about it. So the pushback we have is mainly from people who are curious about what we're doing. They're saying it doesn't make sense. This sounds right. Things you've said before sound good, but what's going on here? This is not what I've heard before. So actually I'll give them all to you. Couple different questions. One is, this is a quote: indefinite utilization of MAT is best practice. So an assertion there. So isn't the idea of tapering from it arbitrary, and isn't it anti-harm reduction? In other words, anti-MAT would be anti-harm reduction. Should I go through them all?
Our great colleague Aaron Ferguson, as I said, says in working with MAT recipients, they often taper on their own because they have a desire to be free of drugs. We certainly, at the same time that we don't despise or put down people for using drugs or relying on them. We don't feel that that's the ideal situation. We're willing to we hold out the goal of a non-addicted lifestyle. And many people do, and they're persuaded against it by their providers.
So it could get boring because I think we're just in a variety of ways going to answer. Best practice actually is figuring out what a person needs and wants and helping them achieve what they want.
And not artificially designing a ceiling and in fact running against what they potentially go on. Why don't you just throw in the dependence addiction?
Another question was, doesn't the Life Process program know that there's a difference between dependence and addiction? And that was actually a couple people asked that. Are you not making a distinction between, I guess they're saying, physical dependence on a drug and addiction to a drug?
I always love it when people tell me what I don't know. For some reason, I've had that experience quite a bit in my life. And in fact, what we know has changed. And don't tell anybody I said this, Zach, it's changed because of me. DSM-5 doesn't use the word addiction, and it doesn't use the word dependence. In fact, we, to some extent, are trying to bring back the term addiction. People have a concept that addiction is something a spot on the brain, you find it, boom, they're addicted. And these people aren't addicted, but that's just not the way life works. People cycle in and out of addictive, more addictive and less addictive problems. And DSM-5 correctly places substance use disorders, including alcohol, on a scale that can slide up and can slide down. And one of the things we'll talk about, you had a person on last week, Mikey, who's a man who's been up and down that scale. It's almost like practicing an instrument. Human beings shift back and forth. Obviously, Vietnam veterans returning who were once addicted to narcotics, even when they use narcotics again, didn't behave in exactly the same fashion. So that whole, don't you know, Stanton and Zach, the difference between addiction and dependence, I don't want to get on a high horse, but that distinction, that meaning, that definition has been changed. Well, I'll have to say it because of me. What else do you want to add about all of this?
I'll just say, just to brief that one. That question, I guess, is trying to ask if you lose the don't you know, I guess and then you want to take it as a question in earnest, then it's something like, I guess it's trying to ask us, what do you think it is that medication deals with? I mean, don't you seem like eager to get people off of medications, and do you make a distinction between like when you're withdrawing from a drug, getting sick, flu-like symptoms from a drug, and versus what addiction really means? And don't you know that it's like a mind-body problem that you don't want to get into? I guess the answer to that was anything besides what you just said, is that I guess we acknowledge that there's a difference, but at the same time, it's sort of a moot point, because what we're trying to say transcends that level of thinking. It's kind of I don't mean to be mean about it, but it's kind of a low level question. If you can understand what we're saying addiction is, and that it's an experience that people have.
We don't, in life process program, to bring it back to that, we don't diagnose anybody.
Right.
People sometimes will say, well, am I addicted? And then we say, well, we don't want them to think of themselves as addicts, as though that's an identity. But we say, well, tell us what your problems are. Tell us what your involvement with a drug or something else is. And obviously, once you cast addiction in a larger light, with relationships, with food, with sex, then you have to start rethinking, well, what's physical dependence mean exactly?
Yeah.
And what does abstinence mean exactly? But these are topics we've dealt with before.
Yeah.
We want to just let people know that we're taking a different slant on MAT. The number of people who either wean positively on their own, per Aaron Ferguson, or the number of people who drop out, compliance is ever present. People are always saying, well, I'm just not enjoying the Suboxone, and I'll go back to, whatever drug I was previously taking. That's the basis of that Massachusetts Supreme Court case that created such a stir. The woman who was sent to prison as a base on probation for violating probation was on Suboxone.
Yeah.
And then she went back to her surprising drug of choice.
There's one more question here. It's this is asking about our distinction between MAT and harm reduction. Like, it's saying MAT is harm reduction. So how can you say that MAT is anything like other harmful recovery approaches? And so I actually threw in that, like 12 steps and disease-based recovery approaches. And why would you say it's another version of the disease model if it's really just harm reduction? And I guess our answer to that, actually, go ahead. You looked eager to answer.
We redefine harm reduction for the most simplistic way of thinking of harm reduction is you're allowed to use a drug, but it's not a bad drug. So that's harm reduction. We don't even talk about using a drug or not using a drug. We talk about how a person functions in the world and how they feel about themselves, which, by the way, impairment and functionality, impairment and distress are the two underlying dimensions in DSM-5. I just have to give the American Psychiatric Association investigators credit. And we're focused solely on functionality and identity, and how a drug, that drug, an MAT drug, the drug of choice, any other drug plugs into those two fundamental concepts is what we're shooting at. So we feel, well, MAT is harm reduction. That's the equivalent, is an artificial way of defining harm reduction. It's not clinically and therapeutically justified or beneficial. And our approach, the LPP approach, is to look at an overall existential functioning, which is both more humane and more clinically effective.
So to sum that all up, we are just offering a way for people to get some extra assistance that they might want that usually isn't provided when you enter MAT. So we're kind of saying, you know, once you're on a drug for medical purposes, and some people say you're on it because this is a medicine that's helping you, no matter how sensible people are within that standard, you're still seeing through a lens of, I mean, you're servicing a billing code and insurance and labels. And so we're kind of consultants halfway between, the inside of the medical community and outside. And we kind of have the door open, not standing in front of it, not shooing people out of it or anything like that. But we're saying, how are you feeling? If you need to talk about this experience at all, let's talk about it. And if you want any extra help building a purposeful life with or without medications, then we're here to talk about that too.
And these are essential questions that should be asked clinically on the one hand, and our ever cascading flood of drug deaths tells us it's a necessary function, that what we're doing, even expanding into this new MAT version of harm reduction, isn't solving it. Let's move on into more popular topics.
Let's do it.
What we're doing here is we're presenting alternative views of addiction and addiction treatment in the United States of America. Forgive me again, you're such a down-to-earth person, Zach. I like to think you balance me out. I think we're providing an essential service that isn't available, and an outlook that isn't available anywhere else in the United States. I think they should build a national monument to us in Washington, D.C., because nobody's asking these questions. Nobody's examining the roots of addiction and the roots of addiction therapy and conceptions the way that we are.
Nobody's allowed to.
And part of the permission, remarkably, comes from their own minds. It comes from drug policy reformers' minds. It comes from government minds and public health minds. And often, and this is the worst thing, I think, for both of us, this is one thing we agree on, it comes from the person's mind themselves.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to raise a child. I know you have a small child. I have young grandchildren who thinks of themselves as having a disease or being addicted. We're people, you and I agree, who don't think it's a benefit of advanced society for people to grow up and conceive of themselves over a lifetime as having some kind of a mental disorder or disease.
Yeah.
There was an article in the New York Times about where a woman wrote in and said, I just learned that I'm autistic in my 20s. Why didn't somebody tell me that earlier? We don't share that point of view. And for better or worse, you and I, Zach, are people who could have been diagnosed in our lifetimes and might, based on this podcast, might still be.
Can I tell you a short story? I don't think you knew this. I don't think I ever mentioned this to you, and I don't know why. You came to visit one time, and you had said something that I had long said about myself. So a lot of people will say, hey, have you ever thought about being tested for autism or like Asperger's? I guess it's autism spectrum disorder now, or Asperger's. And I've always said, A little late, don't you think? And you said those words, and that's something Sam and I talk about and joke about now. It's like, don't you think you're autistic? Who cares? And so you came over one time and you said that same thing verbatim. You said, people sometimes ask me, why don't I get, maybe you're autistic. You say, yeah, well, maybe it's a little late for that. I've always thought that was funny.
And of course, manic, bipolar. I mean, you and I could qualify for quite a few. I'll never forget when my wife, a formidable woman, and I went in with our older son, who was very frenetic and all. And they said, well, he has ADD or ADHD, whatever. We'd like to put him on Ritalin. And without looking at each other, me and my wife just both shook our heads no.
Yeah.
And wherever he is right now, my older son, I've been in a park with him with his own kids, and they're running around. He's a high-level e-commerce guy. He'll sit with a tablet doing advanced coding, looking up once in a while and looking at his kids. And I'll say to him, Dana, didn't you used to have trouble concentrating? I couldn't do what you're doing right now. And, the answer is they pay him a lot of money and a lot of people depend on him to do that. But let's move on to some more. What we're doing here is creating different mental categories and boundaries for thinking about addiction. And the way we usually do that is talk about individuals who don't fit into normal narratives. And often they fit themselves into those narratives. So I just want to, give a quick overview of some of the places we've been. We've talked about famous kids who were declared lifetime addicts, and then they stopped being addicted. Lo and behold, and examples of that, of course, are Drew Barrymore and Lindsay Lohan. That last week, when you talked to Mikey, you talked about a human life, a person whose drug use waxes and wanes. He's actually had positive experiences with drugs and alcohol and negative ones. And they go along with their ups and downs in life. And our approach in LPP is to help them with the ups and downs to the extent that substance use contributes to those downs, that we help them to trace it back to that and to reorient their substance use one way or the other. So there's a third category, and that's another one that we talked about just recently, which is Dax Shepard, who bends himself into a pretzel trying to explain how he's relapsed after 16 years. Well, not exactly relapsed, because he had actually been using opioids previously to when he got relapsed. And when you start trying to make sense out of the craziness, which is recovery, you end up saying, what? It makes no sense with all, whatever, which isn't the worst problem. The worst problem is that in doing it, a person makes it harder to actually live with themselves and to live their lives. So for current events this week, we're talking about the cover of the Rolling Stone on January 2021. Are you old enough to remember there was a song on the cover of the Rolling Stone about a guy who gets on the cover of the Rolling Stone?
I don't remember it.
It was during my lifetime. And Miley Cyrus is on it, and the title of it is, "It Would Be a Cold Day in Hell for Her to Relapse." Except she relapsed. Depending upon how you talk about relapse, she's 28 years old. She's just put out a new album. And that's why she's talking to people, because she's a businesswoman. Before I say anything else, I don't listen to Miley Cyrus's music, but I admire her nonetheless. She's a person who's defined herself. She was Hannah Montana on the Disney Channel, and that's who she really was. And you and I can both tell stories about young stars who didn't make it to adulthood. They didn't make it fully into adulthood. Some of them didn't even survive into adulthood or adulthood. She has. She's obviously got some kind of a knack for coming across in public, for performing, and God bless her for making a ton of dough. So she's doing this interview because she's dropped a new album. And her point of departure in the article in the Rolling Stone is that she hasn't done drug in years, but she fell off, quote, her sobriety during the pandemic. Do you recall how she fell off, what that means?
I can't remember. Like, there were a couple things, right?
She drank some alcohol.
Was that all she? Oh, I should let you tell the story.
As far as we know, that's what she did. Well, how do you react to the fact that we don't know how bad, people, when they use terms like addiction and they were on drugs, we have a hard time knowing what that means. How do you react to the fact that she fell off by drinking during pandemic? What's your reaction to that as a clinician?
My reaction to that is that she fell off by being in the middle of a global pandemic, and she had to figure out how she wanted to deal with it. And she remembered that alcohol served her well in situations like that in the past.
So she didn't really sound like she was in a panic about drinking over the pandemic. Your tendency is to think, is that really, are you telling me you've relapsed because you were told that that's a relapse, or do you really feel you relapsed? She didn't give the impression that she really felt she relapsed. Of course, then the counselor could start berating her for not realizing that.
Yeah.
And then she said she has continued to stay away from drugs. I haven't done drugs in years, she says. Honestly, I never try to, again, be a fortune teller. I try not to be naive, she said. Things effing happen. So what's she saying? When in those words, would you say?
Yeah, that's kind of two contradictory things. Stuff happens. Sometimes you make a decision. Why does it have to mean something larger than that in the context of life?
I'm not going to say my whole life I won't take drugs again. The pandemic may come up, and we don't know what drugs she's talking about also.
Yeah.
So maybe smoking pot will be the best thing for me. And then she takes it one step. I would say it would have to be a cold day in hell for me to relapse on drugs. Well, that's that's our version of a harm reduction statement. That leaves open the possibility she'll use drugs, but that she won't relapse to a bad condition that she might have been using drugs before.
Right.
That's our version of harm reduction, not to go back to a bad place. And then she goes into a whole other new realm. It's not her job to be philosophically consistent. She said, speaking about which drugs she would revisit, I thought she said she wouldn't revisit them. She said she would possibly take mushrooms, and she really, really liked ayahuasca. Okay, so she just told us she would never take drugs, but she said, well, some drugs I like.
Psychedelic drugs are okay. That's isn't that getting pretty close to Carl Hart's drug exceptionalism?
That's Carl Hart's drug exceptionalism. She's using it, but who says which drugs are good and which drugs are bad?
Right.
And where does alcohol fit in that? Obviously, 12-step programs, well, they're evolving as we speak. My point of view of addiction has been consistent throughout. It's functionality and identity. They're sort of changing their mind. And some people recommend, one thing, here's her quote. Ayahuasca was definitely one of my favorite. That's our good friend Gabor Mate's drug. Was definitely one of my favorite drugs I've ever done, she revealed. One of my favorite drugs. Because you're one. If I were there, I'd say, well, what's in second place?
Yeah, what do you like other than
marijuana?
Right.
Cocaine, tell me about it. When I did it, I asked everyone else in the room, did your entire life just change? Are you a new person? They all looked at me and said, no. Of course, I find that funny because I was at an Ibogaine conference.
Ibogaine, that's what I was trying to think of. Sorry.
Ibogaine, and it was in Mexico. It brought me to within an inch of my life. I traveled all night to get there because it wasn't in Mexico. It wasn't near the airport.
Mm.
And I was in the same bus with the world's greatest Ibogaine proponent, Dana Peele, which is pretty close to my son's name, Dana Peele. So, and I gave the message at the conference, I was there with Andrew Tatarsky and others. How that drug, which breaks up your fixed way of thinking, can then fit into the rest of your life is a question that has to be answered. Can you integrate that experience? It can be a good experience into the rest of your life.
Right.
Half the crowd thought that was interesting, and half the crowd almost strung me up because they thought ibogaine was the be all and end all.
Yep.
And here she was taking ayahuasca, and everybody else in the room said, no, it didn't have that effect on me. And then they attacked her. This is a quote, "You're so extreme. Of course, you have the most extreme trip of all." So from being a person who will never take drugs again, who will never relapse again, she's remembering her psychedelic experience, which she found more beneficial than everybody else in the room. So talk about complicated drug stories. And how would we describe her experience with drugs? What would we say? What does Miley Cyrus prove about drug use?
That they serve a purpose?
And that it varies with your purpose and where you are in life. It's a tool.
She's tying herself in knots, as we said about Dax Shepard, also trying to put this in some philosophically interesting place. You know, I'm trying to be sober, but I fell off because I drank during the pandemic rather than, I try not to drink, but I did during the pandemic. It helped. You know, you might say that. I try not to do drugs ever again, but, and it'd be a cold day in hell if I do, because that's my purpose, but yeah, I might. And then if you did, what would you do? Well, maybe ayahuasca, maybe psychedelic drugs, ayahuasca and mushrooms, and talking about it in plain speak. And also being able to say that it's not, maybe it's these drugs, even though for some reason that she elevates them, they're being able to do them above other drugs. She says they're nothing magical or anything like that. They're just pretty fun. I mean, it just sounds pretty common.
They were helpful to her. So what we're pointing out is the way that people are taught to think. They're made to think. They have to squeeze their experience into these crazy 12-step categories. Well, I'm addicted. I was addicted. I can't ever use the substance again. Maybe there's some substances I can use again. I'm in recovery. I'm not in recovery. I'm not in recovery because I use. Drew Barrymore says about herself, well, I'm not in recovery. She drinks wine now. And, like a grown-up, middle-aged mother of two. Shoehorning ourselves and people into those categories is crazy, and it's not helpful. I don't know, Zach, if I've ever said anything controversial in any of these podcasts, but I thought I'd take a risk now and maybe say something just a little off-center. Do you know who David Hasselhoff is? Had you been aware of him before I mentioned his name?
Yeah. I was aware of him, especially in his rise to fame in Baywatch, etc.
You were alive when they did Baywatch or something?
I think so.
No, I lose track.
I think I was young, but yeah.
I have with Archie and another friend, we have a young guy who I'm friends with. And we have a sports thing where we bet on games and things like that. And every once in a while, we mention the name of some famous guy, like Johnny Unitas, and he looks at us like, who? A guy who was the most famous quarterback at one time in our lives. That I guess he played before my friend Brett was born.
That's interesting.
So David Hasselhoff was the most viewed person on television ever at one point. He was the chief lifeguard on Baywatch. And then after that, just to make another couple of $100 million, he became the Knight Rider. So everybody knew who he was. And now he's still only 60-ish. He looks great. He's working out. He's no longer a super duper star. But, I saw this interview with him. He's a good-looking guy, still in great shape. He's got this beautiful 30-ish girlfriend. He's 60-ish. And he's on television again. This is why I thought about him. He does a short film, which I've seen. I don't know what the ad is for. I honestly don't. It's a short film from Pluto TV. He plays every role, appearing as himself. hosting a shouting, it's an infomercial. He plays a bickering couple surfing for stuff to watch on the tube. A proud pop who sent his son to college with the cash he saved using Pluto's free streaming service. A surgeon and his wide-eyed patient. Try anesthesia next time. Getting back to useful drugs. A goateed golfer and an uber intense housefrau. You know, sometimes I see things on screen and I don't know what they're advertising anymore. I'm so out of it. I don't even know what it is I'm supposed to buy.
Yeah.
But I did think, he used to be this sort of goofy lifeguard and all. Now he's kind of doing a comic routine. He's funny because he gets dressed up in all these costumes. And I'm thinking, it's good that he doesn't take himself too seriously. And as this piece on him said, that's 9 Hasselhoffs in 100 seconds. Is this the greatest ad of all time or what? That's what they said. I enjoyed the ad.
So he's like playing a caricature of himself in different scenarios on this ad and to sell something. You don't know what.
And he's not going to run around the beach semi-nude anymore at 60. You know,
Right.
people sort of say, you know, that doesn't work, buddy. But David Hasselhoff did famous for something in between being whatever he is now and being a hunk on TV.
Yes.
There's a famous drunk clip, a trauma event in 2007, where he's shown drunk shoving down a cheeseburger, and his young daughter, a young teen, is heard in a voiceover employing him. That's too strong a word, you know, Dad, you know, should you really be drinking and don't you have to work and go to an interview?
I'm actually going to play that video right now.
Go ahead.
So, Dad, are you going to do your show tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
You promise me?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get alcohol?
What?
Don't get alcohol.
What?
Don't get alcohol, because you see what it's doing to you? You're on the floor.
Mess.
What?
This is a mess.
Now, that was done in 2007. And now, when he comments on it, he said, I never played into it. My daughters, there's only one daughter, I think, in the scene, and I thought the cheeseburger rant was funny. Now, how is the average recovery person going to react to David Hasselhoff's talking about him falling down drunk in front of his daughter, and now he's saying, we thought it was funny. How are they going to react to that, would you say?
I think the terminology that they would use is grandiose, Bacchus, a few other words to not flogging yourself for doing things, looking back and flogging yourself for doing things like that. If you look back and say, that was kind of funny, I mean, you're just in the deepest throes of your addiction.
Right. It's part of denial. It's part of, don't you realize, by the way, there's actually a behavioral therapy, and what that behavioral therapy involved was people, when they're drunk, think of themselves as being very grandiose. So they show them a video of what they actually look like. David Hasselhoff has seen that video, 5,000 times. And his reaction, along with the kind of joking personality he has in his ad, is something like, well, God, that was sort of funny. What a goofy thing to do. He doesn't drink now. And he kind of learned from that experience, or from that period. He used to drink all the time. At this point in his life, apparently he doesn't. And he views that as funny. And isn't that a healthy point of view now? He's 60 now. That period is over. He seems to have a good relationship with his daughters. Why shouldn't he have a good relationship with his daughters? I had know nothing about his daughters, but he could probably afford to send them to college, a good college, and they probably had a fairly affluent lifestyle. Man made a few $100 million. And, he's still around. He's still active. He seems like a fun dad. He seems to have a good relationship with them. And And what's it mean for the daughters not to say, oh my God, I'm the daughter of an alcoholic? They actually played a constructive role in their father's life. They said, Dad, this isn't good. You've got jobs to do. You've got an image to maintain. This is after his peak period where he's trying to reorient himself to be a saleable star and make more money. And his daughter's helping him. And she's not freaked out. She's not being abused. He's not an abusive drunk. He's not an attractive drunk. It's not a good look. His daughter doesn't admire it. But a lot of kids have a lot of corrections and contributions to make about their parents, a lot of things they can say that in ways can be helpful. He seems to have had a positive interaction with his daughter, playing a positive role in him seeing himself drinking and changing that behavior.
Are you thinking that the standard track there would be something like that he's supposed to take is allow himself to be canceled as a celebrity for a while because of this incident, apologize profusely, and then adopt the recovery narrative? That's how he gets back on track.
And he says it's almost an act of bravery. He says, I never played into it, which can be translated into saying, well, I don't call myself an alcoholic. I don't drink now. I didn't say I was acting out alcoholically. I mean, my daughters and I laugh at it. It was kind of funny. I didn't do anything bad. I mean, I didn't go out and drive my car, hurt myself, or kill anybody. I didn't curse my daughter out. I've changed. My daughter helped me change. It's a different narrative. It's a narrative that if you never heard of 12-step recovery, you could understand, but now you have to fight against it. Your understanding of addiction in order to see it as a positive interaction he had with his daughter, where she learned efficacy about herself, that she could be an influential person, where her father showed her he loved and respected her enough to change because of her.
Point.
And a lot of parents could do a lot worse than having that sort of an interaction with their kids. So here's to David Hasselhoff. I never watched Baywatch. I never watched the car picture he was in. I did watch that ad, though, I have to admit. And I was mainly thinking, this is funny. This is ridiculous, because he's a big guy and he's getting dressed up in women's clothes and every kind of thing like that.
It sucked you in.
I thought more of him watching that goofy ad, which maybe he was acting out the way he could have acted out when he was drinking previously. Maybe he has a sensory memory of how to act like an idiot from when he used to drink too much. So this is our story for today. We've discussed medically assisted treatment and how we see it completely differently. And people say, you don't understand MAT. You don't understand harm reduction. And we're saying, no, we're rethinking it in a more constructive way. And now we're talking about with Miley
Cyrus.
Yes. And with David Hasselhoff, how the categories that we are used to thinking about these things don't make sense about these people's lives. And there are more constructive ways of thinking about it.
Well done.
As I said, they should build a national monument to us for rethinking the entire basis of how we're dealing with substances, which isn't going well.
Maybe one day someone not from Earth will come down and we can sort of have our archives, and they can match that up against everything going on in society, and they'll build the monument on their home planet.
I'll have to settle for that. Well, anything you want to say before signing off, Zach?
Just
on this wonderful Sunday.
Just to thank you so much for doing that. That was somehow brief and chock full of everything that we wanted it to be. So, and 2 stories in one. Hope people have a happy Sunday. And next week we're actually talking to one of our coaches at LPP and her very interesting life story, and Earl.
Can't look forward to anything more than that.